Thank you to all the speakers, and thank you, Matthew. As expected, we have loads of questions on the subject of cognitive diversity. So I'll start off with the first one from Hebzi, who's asking whether there is a risk of companies using cognitive diversity to avoid addressing social inequalities and having truly representative leadership.
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, there is a risk of that. One of the reasons I wrote Rebel Ideas, which goes into the concept of cognitive diversity, innovation and change in some detail, is because my sense is that the diversity agenda was failing. And it was failing for a number of reasons. I went to an HR conference where an HR executive was at the front saying, you need to diversify the workforce. If you diversify the workforce, it won't just be morally good, but it will also improve performance. And this was stated as a matter of objective truth. And a slightly awkward person at the back put their hand up and said, imagine I'm a coach of a sprint relay team at the Olympic Games. And my team is comprised of Usain Bolt and 3 other Usain Bolt clones. There is no diversity at all. There's no diversity of gender, no diversity of sex. I mean, these are clones, and yet I have the 4 fastest runners in the world. If I diversified that team, I would inevitably be bringing in slower runners. That isn't going to improve my probability of winning the Olympic Games. It seemed to me that was an entirely valid objection to what the HR director was saying. When it comes to simple tasks, cognitive diversity doesn't contribute to performance. It doesn't contribute to performance with bricklaying. The productivity of 3 bricklayers is effectively, with a few give and takes, just a simple sum of the creativity of its individual members. So a lot of people feel that diversity undermines the concept of meritocracy. The interesting thing is this intuition turns out to be false when one changes from linear and simple activities to complex activities. That's when diversity really begins to make a difference. And the only way to get people to buy into improving diversity is if they think it's going to, largely, if they think it's going to improve the bottom line. And positioning it as a performance issue, given that demographic diversity is often so important for cognitive diversity, I think it will bring that additional demographic diversity, which, as you imply in the question, is so important for issues of morality and social justice.
Fantastic, thank you so much. We have 2 related questions from Alistair and Jack. What steps should business leaders take to foster cognitive diversity through current recession? And what are the kind of like practical tips to move from fixed mindset to growth mindset?
Well, those are very good questions. Thank you. So when it comes to moving from fixed to growth, can I give you 2 very practical things, one on growth mindset, one on diversity. So it'll give you an insight into what the culture was like at Microsoft when Nadella took over, that when he told his senior leadership team on their first retreat that his #1 objective was creating this growth mindset culture rather than a fixed mindset culture, a few members of his senior leadership team came to him and said, yeah, we need to find the 5 people in a fixed mindset and sack them. And Nadella was like, no, this was not the point of what I was trying to do. What he wanted to, effectively what he did is he said, right, this is my #1 objective. Growth mindset is now the #1 value in the organization. And I'm going to get you, my senior leadership team, to take the diagnostic tool. Let's measure where we are with mindset. And this diagnostic tool gives a report, and it gives people an opportunity to do something that they don't often do, which is self-reflection. Because almost everyone thinks intuitively they're in a growth mindset. If you take the person in your organization who is the most status quo orientated, who hates to collaborate, who's done things in the same way for the last 20 years, and you say, are you in a growth mindset? They'll say, yeah, I am actually, very much so. What this report does, it gives them an opportunity to say, you know what? Maybe I have done things in the same way for a long time. Maybe I do get defensive where people point out my weaknesses. Maybe I do find it difficult to collaborate with diverse voices because it challenges my own worldview. Maybe I could think in a more creative way about the way I lead, about the way I do my job. That's a great way of beginning the shift. taking the diagnostics, self-reflecting, and going through that journey as an individual. But he followed it up with town halls and a range of other things, which helped to shift 120,000 people distributed around the world to what I think is a really enriching growth mindset culture. Talk about that in some more depth. On the issue of cognitive diversity, I think the question has picked up on the fact that you can't measure it in the abstract because it all depends on the context. Remember the example of the group advising the football coaches, we're cognitively diverse and useful, but in another context would be cognitively diverse and completely redundant. So one tool that can be used, we've done this with FTSE 100 companies with some really great results, is you get people to sit down in the senior leadership team and to write down who are the voices we're not hearing from. Where is the Stanley Sedgwick? Where is that particular piece of the jigsaw that we haven't catered for so far? Get them to think creatively. It may be an age thing. It may be that everyone is middle-aged, and it might be that a younger person with a different perspective on young aspirations or a way young people connect with technology might be quite important. It may be a gender issue that needs to be addressed, because of course diversity in gender can be massively important in all sorts of different ways, but it may be to do with intellectual or professional background. Maybe we need somebody with an understanding of machine learning in this group, because at the moment, because one of the problems with senior leadership teams is they can, to go back to the first question, is they can often look diverse demographically, but have no cognitive diversity. You've seen this in professional services. You know, I've given talks to boards of directors at professional services companies, and they all think they've been there so long that they think in the same way. They use the same historical precedents to reason through problems, the same metaphors. They're kind of identikit thinking, and they're missing the big picture. When you get people to have the discipline to sit down and write down where are the voices we're missing, post them on a notice board, get them to vote to take these ideas to the next level, you start to surface where the cognitive diversity is missing in that context. And it can make a massive difference to the collective intelligence of the group by bringing 2 or 3 voices in that can disrupt usefully the monolithic perspective of the extant group.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And would you say that's the good way of kind of like mitigating the tendency to align with the group norms and kind of like, you know, follow what the top management is saying?
Well, this is, so really one might, that's a great question, because one might think of this as a 2-stage problem. The fundamental question, and I noticed, is there anyone, Kane, on the call from financial services or banking or?
Yes, there's loads of them.
Okay. This is quite interesting. I think the most, you know, if you're interested in making good forecasts and predictions, and I maybe should have built this into the speech, so apologies that I didn't do so, but you can get a sense of the scale of the uplift in the quality and performance of a group by thinking about forecasting or making good predictions. The reason I don't mention it is people get bored by this particular area of human activity, but it is really important because any judgment contains an empirical hypothesis of one kind or another. If you've decided to tune in this morning rather than going for a walk, you've implicitly predicted you're better off, you're going to gain more from tuning in. So every judgment has a prediction built in. Why do some people make better predictions than others? The best research on this was by Jack Soll of Duke University. He took the top 258 economic forecasters in the world and he measured their track record. It was a bell-shaped distribution, a Gaussian distribution, as you would expect. And the most accurate forecaster was about 5% more accurate than an average forecaster. So nothing terribly surprising so far. But then he put the top 6 forecasters in what you might call a nominal team, and he took their collective judgment by taking the average of their forecasts. Now, in a simple activity like running, like the Usain Bolt case, if you take the time of the fastest runner and compare that time with the time of the average of the top 6 runners in a race, what is faster? The time of the fastest runner or the time of the average of the top 6? Kane, what is faster? He wasn't listening properly, so he might not have
the fastest runner.
Has to be faster, has to be, unless it's a dead heat, in which case they're both the same. But But when thank you, Kane, when Sol compared the accuracy of the top forecaster with the accuracy of the average of the top six, the average of the top six was more accurate, but not just a bit more accurate, not 2% or 5% or 10%, 15%. This is a staggeringly large effect. Why is there this effect? It's only because of cognitive diversity. When you combine the information contained in 6 models, you must have more information than is contained in any one model alone, even the most accurate model. Each of these models also contains errors and blind spot and biases. This is true, but the technique of averaging means that they filter out. Some are a bit higher than the eventual turnout of the oil price. Some are a bit lower. On aggregate, these cancel. So you're pooling the information and filtering the error. The interesting thing is that economic forecasters are often unaware of this property of collective judgments. Moreover, they tend to like to work with people who use the same model as themselves, which means that it just shuts down their capacity to make wise forecasts. We're seeing the same problem in epidemiology. Was unaware of this before this particular problem, but you take the average of epidemiological forecasts, you get a better prediction than any one epidemiologist. But this is very counterintuitive, because it seems like you're diluting the quality, but you're actually contributing quality when you have, by the way, the research in this area, it's called the wisdom of the crowds, has moved on dramatically in the last 15 years. And optimizing the wisdom of small crowds is now, in my view, fundamental to the way private equity, hedge funds, and investment banks, and all other organizations operate. But I want to leave you with this thought. If you could take and clone the most accurate forecaster in the world, you hire the most accurate forecaster in the world, and you clone that person and put 6 of them in the team, every member of your team is more accurate than any member of any other team in the world. In a sprint relay context, that's a great team. But we know from the Sol experiment that that team would be 15% less accurate than a more diverse team whose individual members are less accurate. Now, that's quite a lot to take in, and some of you will get this already, but this gives you a direct mathematical insight into the power of cognitive diversity and why it matters so much. That was a long answer, sorry. I promise the next one will be like no more than 38 seconds.
No problem, no problem. That's great. So another one. So we talk about kind of cognitive diversity within one organization and how that helps competitiveness. When we look at the grand challenges and things that we're trying to kind of like, with Mission Beyond address, such as reducing loneliness, which is, it's not a problem that one organization can solve. How does cognitive diversity help to address the kind of like cross-industry collaboration and kind of like thinking beyond just your own, organization and really starting to collaborate maybe with your competitors? And thanks, Barry, for that question.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Barry. Well, this is a great example because with a complex problem like loneliness, there's lots of different dimensions, as with all complex problems. And you often have organizations that are very good at understanding one part of that dimensionality, a different organization which will be understanding a different part of that, and another organization which will understand something else. Bringing these different organizations together to think about how they can combine their ideas is very important. Now, I want to say one other thing, which is, again, going to sound slightly conceptual, but is very important. When it comes to making predictions, taking the average of independent forecasts is a great way of getting an accurate forecast. This is not a good way of coming up with a good solution to a problem, because you could have 2 different potential solutions, and when you try and average them, it's incoherent. This is where you get the problem of a camel is a horse designed by committee. With problem solving, you don't want to necessarily take averages, but you still need these diverse groups or diverse organizations coming together, because they can begin to share information, number one, but also the different proposed solutions often operate as ways of nudging the overall group to wiser and more innovative solutions. So even though in prediction you can mathematically measure the uplift in intelligence of 15%, you get the same effect in problem solving. It's just that it's more difficult to provide a precise mathematical estimate because it slightly varies from context to context. But this is precisely an area where you want cognitive diversity.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask one more question for you, Matthew, and then there's one question which I think could be interesting as a panel discussion. Are you in support of kind of like affirmative action to ensure greater cognitive diversity in kind of like management? And that question comes from David.
Hi, David. I am slightly torn on this, I have to say. On balance, I think I'm slightly skeptical about it. There were 2 or 3 randomized controlled trials that took place, effectively natural experiments, where there were gender quotas mandated for boards of directors, and they worked much less effectively than I think many of us were hoping. And one always ought to be guided by the evidence. And I think one of the reasons for this, and there's a number of different reasons, but one of the reasons is that when somebody comes into a board of directors and other people think that that person is there, not because of what they can bring, but because of their gender, their ideas tend to be downgraded and devalued. This can happen in quite a subtle way. It's interesting reading the evidence of the people, I think it was Norway, wasn't it, that mandated the boards, and there was just quite a clear correlation between those companies that had a greater uplift in the number of women on the board and what happened to equity value. I think that this works much better organically, but of course it can be slow organically unless, and this is the key point, unless companies truly understand why it matters, those new perspectives are valued and are used as part of the process of how these organizations improve. So I think one of the things they do very well at Bridgewater, you may not agree with everything they do there, but in the onboarding process is all about getting people to understand the value of diversity to making wiser decisions on behalf of the organization. And so there was a sort of an implication in one of the earlier questions. You say you get the right number of people, you get the right people in a room and it's diverse, but you have no real, let's say there's a leader in that group who doesn't value diversity and then gets punitive when people offer a slightly different view to the view offered by the leader. Can you see how that shuts down the expression of diverse opinions? People don't say what they think, they say what they think the leader wants to hear. So in addition to having a group of diverse individuals, you need a culture of diversity. A safe, psychological safety is a bit jargony, but it basically means where people feel they can say what they think. That's where you get this very dynamical interaction in meetings and other forums of that kind. When you get both of those things right, I think you get the best solutions. And that trying to, as it were, shortcut your way there with diversity quotas, I think can sometimes undermine the objective that I hope we're all seeking to achieve.
Excellent, thank you so much. We have 5 minutes, so I'm going to ask one more question to everyone, and maybe start with Harry. In the current kind of like remote working world, and this question comes from Natalie, how do we really encourage and embrace like innovation and creativity? Like, are we finding good ways of really embracing and cognitive diversity, creativity, really making the best use of our brain while not being together?
It's a great question, and it's much harder. We're at the moment, I think Andreas mentioned it, we're looking into health and well-being in primary school kids, and at the moment we're trying to run an innovation sprint around that and actually finding information. There's so much out there on the internet and loads of studies and things like that, but finding people, cognitively diverse people from different backgrounds to speak to is much harder, because we are, rather than being able to go out on the streets and speak to people, we're much more inhibited by our ability to reach people to speak to through our own networks. And, you know, as Matthew mentioned previously, you know, we surround ourselves with people that are very similar to ourselves. So it is more of a challenge, but it just kind of spurs us on to, you know, start asking for introductions to more people, or, you know, getting in touch with people that we perhaps wouldn't have done before directly, to ask them for their advice and to reach their networks. So yeah, I mean, you need a rigorous process to do innovation properly. But as part of that, you need to have cognitively diverse opinions to help shape your ideas. So that's probably not the right answer. It's harder, but that is the fact. And we are learning a lot at the moment about how we approach future engagements like this.
Andreas, anything to add to that?
Yeah. So especially when it comes to innovation and creativity, it's quite ambiguous. So it's not, you cannot point to things with like well understood words that everybody understands in the same way. We try to find something new, right? So while this is the case, I feel like to create a safe space and trust in the group is like critical, which if people haven't worked together in the same room, we need to spend extra time to establish that. And because words can be quite ambiguous, these are moments where we normally would go to a whiteboard to sketch stuff out and say, oh, I would see that more here, or this on top of the other, or whatnot. That becomes very clear when we have boundary objects where we can draw things and have a visual representation of our thoughts. And we use digital tools for that, like Miro, for example, to fill that gap. And as well, because we are not in the same room, you need extra rituals to align on the roles and responsibilities that we can move forward and actually take actions. Who does what? When do we do stuff? When I'm stuck, I reach out to help. That there are channels to facilitate that we can move forward at pace. All these things are easy when you're sitting in the same room. When everybody sits in their own room by themselves, we need to make sure the communication is open in the group and we can work together effectively. So, 3 thoughts on that.
Great. Kane, anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I mean, the process that we use with regard to how to innovate, test desirability, like can be done digitally. So we do that digitally anyway. We kind of, Google is a great enabler for us to be able to test heat in the market for an idea. So there is still, although the human connection part of cognitive diversity in your tests is much harder to do, there is still a huge amount that you can do in order to test, desirability, feasibility, viability when it comes to leveraging digital to do it. And so, it's not ideal being locked down, but actually it's not too much of an inhibitor to being able to innovate.
Matthew, any thoughts from you? How are you finding the remote world?
Thank you. I've just been reading through some of the Zoom webinar chat whilst listening to these very good answers. There are some absolutely fantastic questions and insight. I have to say, it's been a real pleasure. I mean, one thing I think about COVID, if I may say so. I mean, I think my sense is that there's been massive variation in the response from company to company and industry to industry. I think everyone was confused in the first week. I had lots of conversations with CEOs who were worried and anxious, and I was too. And I think all of us were deeply conscious that this was an unprecedented crisis. But I have seen, some law firms, doubled down on what they've been doing. They're sticking by the billable hour. They think of client meetings in the same way. They're very resentful of what's happened. Others have been much more agile. They're using software to create information sharing within the group. They're looking to other industries to how they're solving similar problems. They're starting to reimagine their client interaction. They're slightly more on the curve of using machine learning to cut out errors of execution in the drafting of contracts. So I think there's and that's a massive growth mindset response. And you've got to remember, the people who engage with me, they're quite self-selecting. They're often people who are very agile in this particular way, and who I think are thinking in a very creative way about how they deal with the problems. In terms of the government response, I think you can see very clearly that SAGE lacked cognitive diversity. It was very dominated by mathematicians and modelers and clinical academics, but there weren't very many, or if any, public health professionals or frontline experts in communicable diseases. And I went and looked at all of the government papers up until March 2020, and they were still thinking about this entire problem through the prism of pandemic flu, which is not something you seek to contain. It just goes through the population. But we knew from February that this was being contained in Asia. And when they looked at the modeling, they only really modeled either free flow of the virus or complete lockdown. They didn't look at containment as an option. And Chris Whitty has admitted extraordinary admission that they didn't ramp up testing in that crucial period in late January and February and early March, even though many people were asking for it, but they didn't publish the scientific advice. Do you remember, they became extraordinarily closed in the way that they were advising government. They didn't want anyone to know what advice they were given. And it was a classic problem of a monolithic view that could easily have been challenged by some insights from the outside. So I think this is going to be one of the great lessons of COVID. There's one way to go, by the way, and it may well be that it does become endemic in the end. But there's no doubt at all, there's a consensus now amongst scientists that we should have ramped up testing earlier, and we should have modeled for coronavirus with containment. And we didn't do that. And it seems to me very clear from the remarkable minutes that have been published that this was a clear problem of groupthink.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. I wasn't aware of that, and what a great example. I'm conscious of time, and thank you, Matthew, so much for sharing your insights. I feel like we could continue this, and we might need to bring you back at some point to check in where we are with Mission Beyond, and hopefully some of the insights are helping us to advance what we're trying to achieve with it.
I just want to say, I'll sign on. I know I'll probably have to go in a minute, but I want to say thank you for inviting me. I love what you're doing, Mara, Kane, all of you. It's a great project. I have loved if anyone wants to email me and with questions, or if you want to forward them to me, my email address is very easy to find on the internet. I've actually seen a few people on this chat that I think I know. So it's been great to be a part of this. I want to congratulate you on what you're doing. And I've really enjoyed being a part of this morning. Thank you.